What is it that makes us afraid of the dark? Does the supernatural exist outside of the imagination? If we experience something that is not possible, is our experience false? Or are the boundaries of reality more vast than science can currently explain? Something happened to me. Something that would change my perception of reality forever. Something that would lead me on a journey around the world, possessing my imagination, leading me deeper and deeper into the spirit world.
Hi, and welcome to The Seeker
and The Skeptic.
I'm Kat, and I'm the flaky, unpredictable, maybe a bit irrational Seeker.
And I'm Rebecca. I'll be your sarcastic, grumpy, close-minded, skeptical host. Or maybe we should just be ourselves.
Sounds good to me. This podcast is going to dive deep into the controversial topics that some may call New Age, or woo-woo, or just plain foolish.
And hopefully look at them with a skeptical but open-minded approach that will encourage understanding and acceptance from both the skeptics
and the seekers. This episode, we're talking about old hag syndrome.
Or as skeptics call it, sleep paralysis.
We watched a documentary called Nightmare about the phenomenon, or whatever you call it.
It's this thing where you wake up in the middle of the night, completely freaked out, and you can't move, you're paralyzed, and then you see something creeping or crawling towards you whilst you lay there in bed, paralyzed. And sometimes it's an old crone, sometimes it's an alien, sometimes it's a human-shaped shadow, and then suddenly it disappears and you can move again, and that's usually when you start screaming.
Yeah, that thing.
So what's your thoughts just hearing the word sleep paralysis? What does it mean to you?
So I had my first experience with sleep paralysis on the night of November the 1st, about 5 years ago. So that night, as we know, it's All Souls night.
Oh yeah, of course. It's the night. It's so you mean the night of November 1st, not the night of October 31st?
Exactly.
Okay, yeah.
It's all Souls. Am I right? Anyway, either way, it's one of those freaky nights, and I was I'd just fallen asleep, and I was actually on my side. Normally, this is reported people lying on their backs, but I was on my side, and I could feel something behind me, like a dark figure, and kind of like breathing, kind of like touching my back. And it felt pretty not pleasant,
And you can't move.
Threatening. And I can't move. And it's not like, and I could see my room. So I was like looking around. It felt like I'm not dreaming. This is real life. And at some point it just kind of went. But by this point, when I'd kind of recovered the use of my body, I was like sweating, bloody scared. This had never happened before. I ran downstairs. I was living with my parents at the time, told my dad about it, and he proceeded to tell me that the house probably is haunted and to tell me some ghost stories, which wasn't helpful. Fortunately, the next day I told my sister about it, and she was like, oh yeah, you had the old hag. And I looked it up on Wikipedia and felt at the time much better that I wasn't alone in this phenomenon.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about you?
The first, I'd already heard about sleep paralysis before I had it for the first time, but it didn't really make it any less scary. So I can't remember where I first heard about it. I think it was probably in a book about alien abduction, because a lot of skeptics think that the phenomena of alien abduction is sleep paralysis. So because people often wake up, they can't move, they see this weird little shape with the big eyes coming towards them, and then they are levitated up out of their beds and taken to a ship and, anally raped, as the aliens usually do.
As they do.
Yeah. So if you substitute a shadow man or an old hag in for the alien, that's actually quite similar account to what people describe as sleep paralysis. So I think I read about it in a book called Abducted by Susan Clancy, which is a great book about the psychological explanations for alien abductions. But when I actually had my experience, I just woke up lying in bed, couldn't move, but I wasn't like distressed by the fact I couldn't move. I just couldn't move. And then I saw this figure, and I was lying on my back, and I saw this figure coming towards me, and it was hooded, like this long maroon hood, kind of like a Tibetan monk might wear. And this, I read a lot about Buddhism and think a lot about Buddhism. So that's probably why that imagery was in my head. And so this figure comes up and I can't see its face, and it gets closer and closer. And then it's kind of above me, but it's not pressing on me. I don't know how it can be above me, but that's the funny thing about these sort of hallucinogenic experiences. You don't know how they work in physics. But the thing's above me, and then I see its face, and it has a face like a dinosaur. It sounds so ridiculous, but like a velociraptor from Jurassic Park kind of thing. Again, obviously I'm being influenced by the media. And my immediate thought is, Paul is fucking with me. My husband, because it feels so real. It doesn't feel like it could be. I know what sleep paralysis is, but I don't think this could be sleep paralysis. I assumed that someone's playing a horrible joke on me, and I just freaked out. And then suddenly I can move, and it's gone. And I turn to him. I'm like, "What the fuck are you doing?" And he's asleep and not very pleased at being woken up and pounded with tiny fists of rage. So yeah, it felt so real at the time. And then as soon as it was weird that I had anger more than fear were provoked. But as soon as that's dissipated, I'm like, oh yeah, of course it was sleep paralysis. Well,
that's the interesting thing I think about even hearing just our experiences, how we instantly jump to different conclusions to explain this thing that we've seen. And I think what we'll be talking about is, at what point does your mind create a story about what is happening to you?
Yeah, at what point do you switch back on and start coming up with explanations? Because there's a moment when you're just in it and you're experiencing it, and you're basically not attributing any story to it. And then at some point, maybe shortly after you wake up, you suddenly create a whole story that explains what happened to you. And that's where people insert the narrative of alien abductions, obviously, or, their husband's fucking with them, or whatever it is, the story that you've come up with suddenly seems very, very real. And then whether you actually assess that story, or you just let it stand and say, well, that must be the truth, because that's how I interpreted it at the time. So the reason why we got into this whole thing is because a couple of years ago, I watched this documentary about sleep paralysis called The Nightmare. So when Kat told me she'd had an experience, I thought, this is going to be the perfect subject for the show. We can watch this terrifying documentary and chat about it and chat about our personal experiences.
That's a good point. And I think that was after my more recent, because I think I've had maybe 3 experiences of sleep paralysis, but I think I had told you about my more recent one.
I didn't know you'd had more than one.
Oh, so my first one was the old hag. My more recent one, which was, I think, what led to this initial conversation.
Yeah.
That was Hatman.
Okay, we're going to talk about him later.
Because I don't know about Hatman. You told me that it's a thing. Very nonchalantly. Anyway.
Oh, don't worry about that. That's just Hatman.
Yeah.
It's a very soothing thing to say to your terrified friend.
Yeah.
So, but there are more than one documentaries about sleep paralysis called Nightmare. So, we ended up watching the wrong one. Well, Kat ended up watching the wrong one.
And it was very good. So it was about an American guy who has sleep paralysis, and basically I don't know if it was to solve his scaredness or actually make it worse, but he goes to different places around the world. What's that?
Oh, sorry, we just had a problem.
What?
You just cut out for a second.
Oh, rats. Okay, at what point?
Just go from the one I watched was about an American guy.
Oh, yeah, cool. The one thing I did watch was about an American guy who had sleep paralysis, and he was freaked out. And I guess to explore what was happening to him, he visited lots of different cultures around the world to kind of find out more about what was going on.
It was a really good documentary, but it wasn't as scary as the one that I actually thought. We'll put links to both in the show notes so people can go for the tame version or the really scary version.
Which is funny because, just as a rule of thumb, the one I watched I thought was still quite scary. And after researching for this show, I did experience difficulty falling asleep for about a week.
No.
I mean, you don't want to experience it again once you've had it anyway. So, yeah, the guy starts actually it starts with his spouse describing his sleep paralysis, and how she wakes up in the night and sees him, and he's kind of trying to scream like, ooh.
I've never heard someone describe what it's like to watch someone experience sleep paralysis before. That's very strange. That would be interesting to see under lab conditions.
Yeah, and his eyes are wide open, which I think is one of the most common parts of this experience. Your eyes are pretty much always open. It's just your body that is paralyzed. And he has basically the old hag experience, and this basically old woman figure has awfully green eyes, which I really love. And apparently, then the documentary goes into how common this experience is. And you can see art that depicts it. And actually, if you Wikipedia search sleep paralysis, you'll see one of these paintings, which is quite common. And about 1 in 5 of us will experience it at some point.
That's what he says, right, in the documentary. Because I tried to chase down that statistic, because he doesn't quote and he doesn't cite anything, which is very annoying. And it's not at the end of the credits either, because I waited. So I tried to chase down that statistic and where he got it from, and I couldn't find it. I found other people saying similar numbers, but with no citations. I found this guy, Dr. Brian Sharpless, who studied the phenomenon. And he said, based on a meta-study of like 36,000 people, 8% of the general population experience it, 28% of students experience it, and 32% of psychiatric patients experience it. So, which is much lower than his numbers.
Low. What?
Yeah.
I don't know.
It seems, that seems low to me, because, anecdotally, I've met loads of people. My husband's experienced it. I have a couple of other friends who've experienced it. So I don't know, but it's unclear how common it is. It'd be really interesting, actually, if listeners can tweet us or email in, tell us about your experiences, and we can conduct a completely unscientific poll and find out how many people actually have it.
I think I'd be really interested to know. So he kind of describes a bit more about what the common experience is, and so he makes some statements that I'm not necessarily sure I totally agree with, because one of the points is that it always feels threatening. And you might think that this is the case, but I'd argue that one of my experiences with it, this whole idea of being awake, being able to see your room and not being able to move, definitely one of them. And actually no, there was another point where I was in some state between a dream and waking, but I'm definitely not scared. It's just a bit annoying that I can't move. And I've actually had that many, many more times.
But that's without seeing anything, without any presence in the room, just the paralysis.
I love the way that you're describing this as an actual presence in the room. Reminding that you're the skeptic. But
without perception of a presence in the room, let's say.
And the other thing he states is that sometimes people smell a horrible smell. And that's very interesting, because I've definitely never smelled anything.
Yeah.
Similarly in dreams, I don't think I've ever smelt anything in a dream.
But that is a common thing with reports of paranormal phenomena. People often say there was a strange smell. I don't know. Yeah. Maybe you could say that maybe there actually was a strange smell, and that's what provoked the bad feelings. Like, I'm feeling threatened because I'm smelling the strange smell in my familiar environment. Or that, like all our other senses, if you're hallucinating, why not have smell hallucinations? Smellucinations.
Sounds our new band name. And he also, and obviously the classic one is a sense that something is on top of us, but I've also heard reports about things lowering down from the ceiling and not necessarily touching the bed, being at the foot of the bed, being in the room, and my one was behind me as I was actually lying on my side.
Wait a minute, if it was behind you, how could you see her?
Okay, exactly. So a lot of this is what's in your head. You're not seeing anything. Sorry to be a spoiler as the seeker here, but like if you're not necessarily seeing anything, I think there is still this ability to, in the same way that people report leaving their body. Yeah. Are you actually leaving your body, or are you imagining the room from a different perspective? Yeah. So
that's an important distinction, because I think probably it's a subtly different phenomena. If it's like a dream that you're remembering something, you're remembering a perception of something versus having an actual hallucination.
Oh, this is interesting. Okay, let's
We should probably get on with talking about the documentary before we go off into the weeds.
I want to come back to that because we'll talk about like how is this happening, in a bit.
Yeah.
So there are these ideas of like, where it comes from in like culture. So if it's just a fairy story that is somehow embedded in our psyche, where is that coming from? And people talk about, I don't know if you remember this part, but the story of Lilith.
I do remember that bit very well because I'm very passionate about Lilith.
I've only heard about Lilith in astrology terms.
Oh,
Black
really?
Moon Lilith. Yeah, there's this kind of negative influence in the sky, Black Moon Lilith. And I think that's what that's based on, is this first wife of Adam.
Yeah. But this, everything, well, I was really into Lilith because, I used to be very interested in the occult, and she's a kind of cool figure. Yeah, as you say, she's supposed to be the first wife of Adam. So when God made Adam out of clay, he made a woman for him as his mate, not for him, just alongside him, also out of clay. And Lilith basically wouldn't submit to him. She wouldn't, she insisted on being on top during sex, and she was just generally a nightmare, couldn't be controlled, and declared that she deserved equal status. And this is all from something called the Alphabet of Ben Sira, which is basically a bunch of satirical Jewish folk stories from like the 8th and 10th century. That's that's the first, where Lilith first turns up as the first wife of Adam. So anyway, she refused to submit. She flew off, and God said if she doesn't come back, her punishment was for 100 of her babies to die every day. So she'd be constantly impregnated by demons and then give birth to babies, and then they'd all die. So it's this tragic punishment, which drove her insane, as you would expect. And that's what makes her want to come and kill human babies. And that's what people are scared of. That's why people will often put like a charm around their baby's neck to protect them from Lilith, because they think Lilith's coming to kill babies. So I don't know what this nonsense is about her coming and like molesting men. I've never heard of that before. She kills babies.
Maybe she's seeking revenge on men, maybe.
She doesn't have time. She's got all those babies to kill. Like...
Poor Lilith. Poor hard done by Lilith.
I think it's a great story. Like, I was really, obviously, I loved it for the feminist implications, because I was like, yeah, damn straight. Why should she submit? She should go and live on the cliffs with the demons. That sounds much better.
And yeah, I'd love to read more about those stories. So that's what the idea of a nightmare came from. The Night Mara was her, right?
Well, yeah, or a female, I'm not calling her Lilith, but yeah, a succubus or some kind of... succubus is like a female demon that comes and sexually molests men. But yeah, like some kind of female presence that comes and like troubles you during the night.
And I heard that vampires came from this idea as well.
Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. So I think more than anything, the problem is with this theory that it's which is feeding off each other. Are we feeding off the stories or what have you? But the thing is, it arises in cultures all around the world. And I hadn't heard of sleep paralysis or any of these stories. I mean, I guess I'd heard of vampires before, but I didn't see a vampire.
The first place that he sort of examines the myth from is in Newfoundland, which is in Canada. I don't really know anything more about it. I just know it's in Canada, and it's a bunch of islands, and they're quite isolated. So it makes for some great atmospheric shots as they're there. And this is where he talks about the classic old hag. So she's this withered old woman. She's kind of creeping and crawling. She's got long fingers. She's, like her eyes are all white. It's like classic horror movie stuff. And this is so annoying to me because I feel like, again, to go on with the feminist shit, but really, why do we just assume, this has always annoyed me in horror movies as well, that the elderly female body is horrific? I hate that. I find it so offensive. Like, that's one of the things I love about Wicca and that whole tradition is that they celebrate the wisdom and beauty of older women. But this is just like, oh, look, she's all old and her breasts are all saggy, gross. It's like if they can no longer present as this perfect, like, nubile young woman who's sexually attractive to men, then she's of absolutely no use and in fact becomes something scary. Oh, it drives me mental.
Well, men have the same. So if you were to say, let's generalize, and this is going down a different route, but this idea that if women are valued for their beauty, which I'm not saying is right at all, and men are valued for their power, well, men have a similar problem in that if you have a weak man, that's like seen as really terrible anyway. Or
but not terrifying. Man. It's not used in horror movies.
It's just a bit sad.
But that's obviously because he's weak. It wouldn't be scary to be confronted with someone who was weaker than you. But I don't know. There's something that niggles with me at that whole thing. Because I love horror movies, and I've seen many where all you see is like an old lady, often naked, in the corner of a room, and that's supposed to provoke you into uncontrollable fear. And I'm just like, oh, poor old lady, she's all lost at night, and why hasn't she got a nightie on? That would be my response. Not,
we must clothe this old lady. So there are a couple of theories about, you know, where is this coming from? Why do we get this like phenomenon happening? And I guess the first one is that you are literally seeing something in your room. And could this be, and that maybe, I think there was one guy, I didn't get his name properly, but I want to say Imants Barus, who believes in the kind of more woo-woo explanation and thinks that we're in this kind of altered state, which is kind of true, right? When we're falling asleep and waking up, we are in an altered state of consciousness.
Yeah.
And when we're in these states, we can see into the spirit world, which again, if you've taken any psychedelics, any entheogens, then you will think that you are seeing things that are existing either in another dimension or in this dimension, then we can't normally see it. And maybe in meditation as well. So in all of these altered states, sleep paralysis is just another one of those, and we are seeing stuff that is there.
And this is, people keep coming back to this because, the question comes up several times in the documentary, could a hallucination feel so real? Like that, people are happy to say, oh, my dreams are just dreams. But this doesn't feel like a dream. It feels like something else. There's a comment under the YouTube video from ATG Compressor with a K. He posted this 2 years ago, and he says, "This is becoming more frequent with me, and I need answers. This shit is not my brain, and scientifically explainable. I'm fairly intelligent, and I know what is real and what is fake, and this is too real for me."
It's so sad how it feels, because it really does feel very real.
But it's like the hubris of assuming that just because I'm fairly intelligent and I know what is real and what is fake, you don't, dude. Like, no one does. Our brains are rubbish at all that stuff, especially when we're half asleep, half awake. And it's also sad, as you say, because he's taken the most scary, horrible thing and just assumed that's real. Yeah. When there is, we can completely explain it scientifically.
Well, so, let's say there are definitely other explanations. And I will point out that, like, I've definitely had the experience of waking up from a very vivid dream and being like, I'm still disturbed by the fact that dreams seem so real at the time.
Yeah.
So if they seem so real, how do we know what's real? And I think this kind of thing like keeps me, not such a seeker, and more, because I am fully aware that we can be in these states, which how do we know if anything's real?
Yeah.
And this is one of those times, but it's one of those times where you're so on the edge of knowing what's what, and either way
it really screws with your perception of reality. Yeah, but I think this thing where we just have a general cultural problem where we don't question our intuitive explanations for stuff. So for Compressor, he feels like it felt real, and he knows that his feelings are correct because he judges himself to be an intelligent person, and that's that. Whereas if we just had more of a culture of self-exploration and understanding your own biases and your own limitations in how you understand the world, then he could probably come to a much more reasonable conclusion, and also one that didn't scare him shitless. Yeah,
yes. And enter theory 2, which is, time to breathe, because this is where I get a lot of relief. There was this guy on the documentary, Dr. Alan Cheney, who says that it's probably brought on by stress and exhaustion. We're naturally paralyzed in our dreams, and we know this for a fact. Sleep, that's how we sleep, because it stops us from moving around and potentially hurting ourselves. But in this state, our mind wakes up, and naturally, we're scared by the fact that we can't move. So we're not scared because we see something. We're scared because of the state of paralysis we're in, and our mind's awake. And that's when we create something. We create something that explains this, deep, I guess it's coming from the oldest, deepest part of our brain. So our more modern mind creates a picture, and all of these other things happen as a result. But we are genuinely feeling scared.
That's exactly the explanation that that guy I was talking about earlier, Dr. Brian Sharpless, he wrote a book called Sleep Paralysis, Historical and Psychological Perspectives. He basically says, first you sense something. So you have a feeling of fear, that's the sense. And then that sense sort of encourages you to see something scary.
To explain your state.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're like, I'm scared. What am I scared of? Oh, I must be scared of that. And then the third thing is feel. So you feel the pressing on the chest, you feel the choking, you feel the levitation, you feel like you're being sexually assaulted. So it's like those three things, but it's set off by, as you say, the fact that you can't move, and that's really scary. So the fear comes up, and then you need to explain the fear.
And it's so amazing, like what we can kind of take from this, because it just goes to show like how powerful our minds are, and how the modern brain that we're using like most of the time, the whatever it is, the neocortex.
Well, don't ask me. I have no idea. ...
But that's not what's running the ship most of the time.
I think I always think about this with roller coasters and just fairground rides in general. Like that feeling of adrenaline and excitement is exactly the same feeling I have before I get on stage to make a presentation.
Yes.
But I'm interpreting them in different ways. So when I'm about to go on stage, I'm scared and I'm nervous and I'm shaking and I have all that adrenaline. And when I'm on the roller coaster, I'm also shaking. I'm having all the same like stuff's going on in my brain and body, but I'm just adding a different interpretation onto it.
Yeah,
that's something I think I was told by some public speaking teacher, that you need to just tell yourself a different story before you get up on stage to give a presentation. Say, I'm shaking because I'm excited to give this presentation because it's important to me.
Yeah,
I don't know how effective you can be at doing that, but tricking yourself.
No, I used to do it all the time. I realized I was doing it before exams, and I realized I couldn't tell the difference, so I decided that I was excited. Yeah. But the only thing about this is that the fear that we feel in, you know, if we do feel a lot of fear in the sleep paralysis, not like I said, mine has reduced over the time, but it can actually lead potentially to heart attacks.
Yeah.
Right? Because, and definitely the first time I had this, my heart was beating super fast. And as well as that, you could say that PTSD could result.
It's a scary experience. It's a traumatic experience.
Yeah, the psychological effect is real, even if what we're seeing isn't. And this is where I think it becomes this really fascinating and kind of sad thing that is happening to people.
Well, that's the next stage of the documentary. Takes us to Japan, and this is where it starts to get a bit more serious. So he talks about, in Japan they have the same sleep paralysis phenomenon, but they call it the kanishibari, which is a similar sort of thing. It comes to you in the night, presses down on your chest. It's a bit different in that they often feel like it could be someone that they knew who's died, or it'll be like a monster, but then the face will change into the face of someone who's recently passed. And that's probably links up with the kind of cultural ideas of ghosts and stuff in Japan, which I'm not that knowledgeable about, but I guess it makes sense in context. And they believe that it's often caused by possession, or witchcraft. That these things don't just come out of nowhere. I think in Newfoundland and in the Western tradition, we just think, oh, they're just, they're demons or they're spirits or whatever. They just come to trouble us. Who knows why? But in Japan, they have an explanation for it, which is they believe that they are sort of invited in by a bad actor, like a witch or someone, someone who wants to cause trouble for you, basically. And that's the same story in Zanzibar, which is not the last place, but the next place he goes in the documentary, where they have what they call the popobawa.
Yeah, this is where I think it takes the most interesting turn, because, do you want to talk more about the exorcism and what happened?
Yeah. So the whole documentary is constructed with interviews with experts. I'm doing inverted commas because some of them I do not feel are experts, and experiencers. So he went to Newfoundland and he had a couple of people talking about experiences with the old hag, and he went to Japan and he had a couple of people talking about the Kanchanabari. And in Zanzibar, he talks to some people who've experienced the Popobawa. But suddenly it feels much darker and much scarier, because he explains that there have been outbreaks of Popobawa attacks in Zanzibar. There was one in 1970, which was shortly after a violent revolution there, so everything's stirred up. There was one in 1995 and one more recently in 2007. And people were so scared of this, understandably, that they started sleeping outside in groups for safety and staying awake for nights on end.
But, people were killed in these times.
Yeah. So this is what I was going to go on to say. Like in Japan, they don't think these things come out of nowhere. They think a sorcerer or a witch has conjured them up or invited them in. And so they will find someone, and this is not unique to Zanzibar. Obviously, we can find examples of witch hunts. It's something humans do, unfortunately. We find someone to blame, and then we pour all our negative attentions and feelings onto them, and they often end up dead. And that's what's happened a couple of times in Zanzibar.
And arguably the thing in Zanzibar, I'm not sure if you got this from the documentary, but it was like people were taking advantage of the women's fear, and that led to actual men like raping and, you know, hurting these women.
Oh, I didn't get that impression, but this it sounds quite possible, to be honest, because if you look at the history of witch hunts and what's happened, or like if you think about the way that people accused of witches were accused of being witches in the Middle Ages, and the things that the inquisitors did to them were horrific. They were just using this whole construct as an excuse to act out their sadistic fantasies, basically.
Well,
and
this almost the other way around. It's almost like this would be like people thinking people believe in witches, and now we're going to take advantage of that by killing people. I'm saying, like, because people knew that the Popabao were scaring people acted like those things.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So that because everyone's blaming somebody else, these men decided to take advantage of that fear and actually do it. And did the fear of the Popabao come from the men? So that's just where my mind went with it. And maybe that's not where.
No, I think you're probably right. And whenever there's a situation of mass hysteria like this, there's going to be some people who are not actually hysterical and who are just taking advantage of the situation. Yeah. Again, humans are horrible. This is what we're learning. So he goes to have the traditional Zanzibarian remedy. In Zanzibar, they have a sort of mix of Islam and African tribal religions. So he goes to see this guy, he's a witch doctor, to do an exorcism to deal with his sleep paralysis problems, I guess. And we see the witch doctor, he explains what's happening. He's like, oh yeah, you've got a problem with the Popabara. Okay, I know exactly what to do. He waves this sort of, so the guy's lying down on his back, and he waves a bit of horn over the guy's chest. The guy's wearing a t-shirt, and he waves over almost like a tricorder, like in Star Trek, to assess where, or to detect what the problem is. And then he seems to find a particular spot, and he gets his thumb and he presses down really hard on that spot. So you can see his thumb sort of going into the guy's, I guess it's like just his top of his stomach area. And then he puts his face down there where his thumb was and sort of sucks or bites at the stomach and turns to one side and spits out what looked like long thorns. It was annoying that they didn't get the camera up there closer to see exactly what was going on. And then they don't talk about it again. No. They don't say, wow, that was amazing. It's just presented for your entertainment and then on to the next segment without any explanation of what just happened.
It was really weird. And I wonder if they're like, oh, that was clearly bullshit. Let's not talk much more about that.
That's exactly what I suspected, because it's psychic surgery. Have you heard of psychic surgery?
I have.
So this is like a really common thing that people do all over the world. It's just sleight of hand. It's sleight of hand magic. And it's a particularly horrible thing to do, because you take people, and usually it's an actual medical problem that people have. They're desperate. They can't get help, or maybe they don't try to get help from traditional medical establishment. And so they go to see a witch doctor or someone who's proficient in psychic surgery. And then they do a sleight of hand trick and imply that they've removed. So often it'll be like they'll pull out a bit of guts, and it's just animal guts or viscera, but they'll tuck it cleverly in their hand so you don't see it, and it looks like they're magically pulling it out of you. This is what happened to Andy Kaufman, the comedian.
Really?
When he was dying, he went to see one of these guys, and it delayed him getting treatment for his cancer, which is really tragic. Yeah, so I don't know why. If they thought it was bullshit, then why include it? But if they didn't think it was bullshit, then why not bring the camera in and talk to the guy about, whoa, what the fuck did you just do?
Yeah.
Very strange.
Yeah, weird. And did you remember the bit about the refugees coming to the US after the Vietnam War?
Yeah. So this is after we leave Zanzibar. He goes on to talk about the Hmong, who are, they're not necessarily from Vietnam, although I think the people that he talks to are, but it's a kind of tribal group that they're in Laos, they're in Vietnam, they're in Cambodia, they're all over that sort of region of Southeast Asia. And a bunch of them start coming over after the Vietnam War as refugees. and they start experiencing what the papers call sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome.
And they thought that this was because they weren't able to practice their spiritual practices in the US. And it's this idea of the nocebo effect. And they thought that because they couldn't practice their spiritual things, they would be affected. And therefore, that's why they were having these kind of nightmares. They were stressed out, maybe not just because of that, but because of like the, having to escape to the States. And this resulted in these, I think, 157 deaths in this time.
Yeah, I couldn't find numbers, but that sounds about right. It's the nocebo thing is the idea that if you believe in something, it can affect you negatively. So the reason it's called nocebo is it's like the inverse of a placebo, because the idea with placebo, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, and I won't lecture you about it again, but I think it's dubious. A lot of things that people claim for the placebo effect are exaggerated, and it's probably the same with the nocebo. So the placebo is if you believe that you'll get better, and the nocebo is if you believe that something horrible will happen to you, maybe something horrible will happen to you. And interesting idea, but actually there's a much more simple explanation for what happened to the Hmong people, which is there's a genetic sensitivity to it's a heart problem basically that can happen with people, and it doesn't have any symptoms. You wouldn't know you had it, and you can just suddenly die. And because of the cultural traditions around the Hmong, they didn't do autopsies. They don't approve of that for whatever reason. So I can't say for sure this is what happened to this group of people, but they have done autopsies on people who've died from sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome. And I think I read the statistics on Wikipedia, and I'll put this in the show notes beneath, but like 95% of cases of this unexplained death can actually be explained when you do an autopsy and you see, oh, actually there was some weakening in the heart wall there was some problem there was some problem there. And there's a specific thing, I'm desperately scrolling through my notes trying to find it, but I can't. There's a specific heart problem that is common to that genetic group that probably explains most of those deaths. So I think the nocebo is not valid here, and maybe not anywhere, I would argue. Oh, that's what it's called, Brugada.
But do you
Brugada, if anyone wants to look it up. Brugada syndrome.
Brugada syndrome. That sounds terrifying, more so than sleep paralysis. But
imagine knowing that it was possible. It's more common in men. So if you're a Southeast Asian man, those are the people who should be worried. It's not common, obviously, because otherwise there wouldn't be a massive news story when it happened. And I'm sure it doesn't help if you're super freaked out and making your heart race because you're scared of demons. So
that's what I mean. It's kind of like, it's interesting how just being scared can have these physiological, really mortally, fatal effects.
Yeah.
But
in combination with other things.
In combination with other things, but also just coming back to sleep paralysis itself, I have this thing where, and I think this is pretty common too, if I think about one of my recurring dreams, or if I think I'm going to have, I'm going to think of the scary thing, I probably will.
You'll have a dream about it, you mean?
Yeah, that seems to be the case. And I just wonder if it's that there is just something more psychological going on when you can work yourself up about something. And hopefully this podcast won't induce any sleep paralysis in anyone. But, I think that's a valid thing. And I think if this group of people were all scared about dying in their sleep, you would be scared to go to sleep, and that would cause more sleep paralysis and probably potentially more deaths.
Exactly, because one of the reasons why people get sleep paralysis is because of a disruption of the circadian rhythms. So staying awake for a couple of nights running is going to disrupt your circadian rhythms, so you're more likely to get it. That's what's so tragic about it. And a lot of the things that people do to try and prevent themselves, you could set an alarm, for example, at regular intervals to wake you up so that you wouldn't get tricked by the demon or whatever. Lots of people have thought of doing that. But again, that's another way to disrupt your sleep cycle and makes it more likely that you'll suffer from sleep paralysis.
It's really an interesting one that kind of really, it's a great example of how our beliefs can affect us.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I'm not denying that our beliefs obviously affect us in many ways, but I think the simple story of these people died because they were scared to death, it's too simple.
Yeah. So the film basically concludes that the filmmaker got no more dreams after the exorcism.
Well, he has another intervention from the Hmong shaman, doesn't he? The Hmong guy, he goes into a trance and does some chanting and ties red strings around his wrist as like a barrier.
I don't know that at all. Okay.
So he's doubled up. He's got the Zanzibarian exorcism, and then he's got some kind of protective amulets things tied around his wrists thanks to the Hmong people. So he's double safe.
And that solved his problem.
Yeah, apparently.
Yeah.
The weird thing is, like, when you see him and he's like, when he arrives in Zanzibar and he's filming himself talking in his bedroom, he's like, oh, I haven't been able to sleep because I'm so worried about the sleep paralysis stuff. He's doing all the stuff that would make him more likely to have sleep paralysis. So as a filmmaker, it's probably a shame for him that he didn't have another episode during making it, because that would have made for a better story.
It would. But it's funny, like, naturally you're going to be more scared going to sleep if you're really involving yourself in this. That's why I couldn't watch the other documentary, because it looked so freaking scary.
Yeah, you just watched the trailer and that was enough, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't even watch the whole trailer because it was so scary.
It's a weird one, because it's like it's kind of like a horror movie / documentary.
Yeah.
So when I suggested we watched it, I did know, because you're not a horror fan, that it might be a bit much. So I'm not that surprised. It was really scary. I was scared by it. But I still highly recommend it. Check the show notes. So what do you think his conclusion was? Like, at the end of the film, I didn't really get a sense of whether he thought this was real or not.
I think he did, because, like I said, I think it definitely stated something like he got no more, sleep paralysis events after this. I think he came down more on the side of, couldn't this be real? But to him, it probably is quite real. Either way, like, he definitely isn't saying this is just a result of, being tired or stressed out.
Yeah. I think you're probably right, because after seeing what happened in Zanzibar and seeing the witch hunts and people literally being killed as a result of believing this stuff, how could you possibly promote it as true, knowing that you're contributing to the myth, unless you actually believe it's true? So I think he must believe it's true. Either that or he's just evil. Because if you don't think it's true and you've seen what harm it can do and you carry on saying it's true, then you're just a really bad person. And I don't think he's a bad guy. So I think he probably does believe it. Yeah,
which is interesting, because I mean, we'll talk about. Do you want to talk about Hatman?
Yeah, I do. But I want to just say one more thing on this guy before we leave the documentary behind. He ends the documentary with this great quote, which is, for those who believe no explanation is necessary, for those who believe no explanation is necessary. For those who don't, no explanation is possible.
Yeah.
Which could be the tagline for our podcast, right?
It's pretty...
I just think it's a really good analysis. So I was like, it said Joseph Dunninger, as the quote was attributed to in the movie. So I was like, oh, I wonder who that guy was. I looked him up. He's a skeptic and a magician.
Oh, cool.
Interesting, right? That he would use that quote, because it's a quote that from the skeptical world. So it just spun me out again, because I was like, I was so convinced that he must believe it. Otherwise, how could he be promoting it as true? And then having the quote from the skeptic on the end, I was like, but what? Oh, I don't know. If anyone has any insight into this film, if you watch it and figure out whether he believes it or not, I'd be fascinated to hear.
We should get in touch. Please clarify this, sir.
Oh, yeah. Now I really wish I'd written down his name so I could. So anyway, yeah. Explain. So you, in your most recent sleep paralysis thing, you saw what I refer to as the Hat Man, but what did it look like to you?
So I woke up, this time I was on my back, couldn't move, knew the drill, and saw this tall looming figure over me. I think it might have had a hand out, but it wasn't really important. But what was significant was this tall, like a top hat. He was wearing a top hat, and it wasn't like a person. It was more like it's close to a person, but it's almost like a cartoon, like a Lowry version of a person. And that was just looming over my bed. It didn't last very long, and I properly woke up and I was fine. And like I said, I wasn't terribly scared. I wasn't like sweating. I was just like, ugh, that was miserable. Annoying. And
is it an actual person or is it a shadow of a person?
I mean, yeah, it's black and blurry. I don't have any like crisp outlines.
Okay, so that sounds like a classic shadow person.
Yeah.
Just from my quick diagnosis. So this was the day we went to the Coven, and we were chatting about it in the car, and you described this, and I said, "Oh, it sounds like Hat Man." And what did you think when I said that?
Like kind of like not surprised, because you do seem to be quite clued up on these characters, but also a bit like, oh, I didn't think that would be so common.
Yeah, it's weird that it's so common, but it really is. So there's this whole thing of shadow people. You could go into an internet hole researching this for ages, and I did. But one of the common things that people see now, like back in the 90s, in the early 90s, late 80s, people saw greys. Now the most common thing to see, for Western people at least, is shadow people. Or at least, I mean, I say it's the most common just from my browsing of Reddit and other forums where people talk about sleep paralysis. It seems pretty common. So they're these figures, just like you described, black, blurry figures that they generally just watch. Sometimes they come forward and like try and suffocate you. And I was really interested, I'm really surprised when you said you'd seen the Hat Man, because I've never seen anything like this, but I had heard of it before. And I'd heard of it just because I listened to lots of paranormal podcasts and stuff. So I did a little bit of research, and the first thing I came across is a book. It's called the author is Heidi Hollis, and it's called The Hat Man: The True Story of Evil Encounters. I'll read you the blurb if you like. See if you'd like to read this.
I'm scared.
Have you seen this man? It was a simple image and question posted online that sparked a worldwide awareness that he is real. That's in capital letters. That's why I'm saying it that way. From the author who discovered him and told you about the shadow people, now learn of this new threat, also capitalized. Victims worldwide have reported seeing this man peering into their homes, their bedrooms, their cribs, their cars, their lives, and even into their souls. It starts with the feeling of not being alone, only to look at the foot of your bed and you find you are right. There's a stranger in your room and you know that you see him. Worst of all, you know that he sees you too. You try to scream or run, only to find that you are paralyzed. Terror then reaches new levels as he approaches you, leans within inches of your face, and lets you know that he is indeed your worst nightmare. This is the true story of the beginning of unthinkable horror that you've never heard of before. God. That's the blurb.
So dramatic. So
I would not recommend reading this book. I read like the first couple of chapters and found it there were more smileys than I traditionally expect in a book.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
I'm not sure who her publisher is. It might be self-published.
Who let it
but she's
happen.
the one who invented the words, the Hat Man. In 2002 on a Coast to Coast show, which is like a paranormal radio show. It was very famous and really interesting and fun to listen to. She came on and she, as she says in the blurb of her book, she's already talked about the shadow people, done lots of work on the shadow people. And she revealed, this invention, this discovery, I guess you would say, of the Hat Man and the way that he'd been popping up everywhere. She basically put out a call for people to contact her with stories of the Hat Man, and she just got loads and loads and loads and loads.
Okay, so if the Hat Man isn't real, please explain why this is cropping up and why I hadn't heard of the Hat Man before I started seeing it, and why it's become more common and greys less common if it's not outside of us.
Okay, well, everything has trends. So there's a reason why back in the day it was succubuses and incubuses, and then it was the old hag, and then it was grey aliens, and then it's now the Hat Man, or shadow people in general. So we know, we've talked about that, what was it? Sense, see, feel thing. So you're there, you're sensing the fear, you look around, and we know that our brains are primed to look for human figures and shapes, because evolutionarily it's convenient to be able to see when there's another human there, and we make lots of mistakes in that regard. So if you've ever glanced over and looked at like your dressing gown on the back of your door and thought it looked like a person standing there, I get that all the time. The other thing I get, it's not people, but if I'm somewhere away from home and I see a shadow down low near my ankles or just down near the skirting board, I immediately think it's a cat, because at home I have 2 cats, and that's what I see.
I had a cat for about a month recently, and now living in a new place, and I heard a squeaking sound and I was like, oh, that's my cat. No, it wasn't.
It's just expectations.
That happens quickly. Yeah.
So your brain is primed to expect cats because that's what you've seen previously. And then when you see something that you're not sure what it is, it says, oh, it must be a cat. It's just and statistically it's usually right, so that all that sort of carries on. That's why people often see ghosts of their cats. Like after someone's cat dies, they often say, oh, I keep seeing him, I keep glancing over at the sofa and thinking he's there, which is really sad and sweet. But it's exactly what our brains do. If they have something that they don't know what it is, they'll give their best guess. So best guess, a kind of largish shadowy shape, is it's a human shape, right?
Yes. So what about... Go on.
What about the hat? Is that what you were about to say?
Yeah, what's the deal with the hat? But yeah, what's the deal with the trends specifically? Like, why isn't my version of a human different to somebody else's from somewhere else?
Well, there's two answers to that question. One is they are different. And when you start reading the accounts of the Hat Man, he's wearing different hats. Oh. Sometimes he's wearing a fedora. Sometimes he's wearing a top hat like you had.
Fuck? Why would he be wearing a fedora? He's wearing a top hat always.
This is ridiculous. How could he change his hat? So I think it's really interesting that we give these shapes that we see the benefit of the doubt. Yes. So if we see a shadow, we think that's a human. Oh, but wait a minute, it's so tall. Oh, it must be a really spooky tall person. Or if we see it's a person, but it's got like weird long fingers, we're like, oh, it must be a person with really long fingers. Or if we see a shape that's like a person, but there's something weird going on, like the head shape's not quite right. Oh, it must be a person wearing a hat. And it's funny, we can never say, oh, it's just a weird shape.
Yes, and it's funny, always got to be... It's always scary versions of these things. So, for example, we are naturally more scared by tall things than short things. Generally
that
speaking.
Makes sense.
We're also more scared by, like you saw the reptile face. Reptiles, we're primed to be scared of them from nature.
Yeah.
And we're primed to be disgusted by old women.
Yeah, maybe. Definitely culturally primed anyway.
Yeah.
So, but why does he look the way he does? Why does he have this appearance? If you type in, people at home, type in villain and look what Google Images turns up. I bet you in the first couple of images for villain, you'll see a person with a hat. It's a classic, it's an iconic image. It's the earliest I could find it, although I'm sure it probably goes back, is like in the newspapers from the Jack the Ripper murders in like 1888, you see a shadowy figure wearing a hat.
Yeah.
It's such an iconic image. And then what immediately popped into my head when I started reading about the Hat Man, because I'm a horror fan, was Freddy Krueger.
Oh, yeah.
Did you ever see Nightmare on Elm Street?
I obviously couldn't watch that.
So the first one came out in 1984. And he is always, and this is probably due to the limits of special effects back in the day, but it makes it really atmospheric and amazing. You see him and you see like him in silhouette, and he's got his hat on and he's got like a knives coming out of his fingers and like a claw hand type thing. That's a classic image. And I was thinking about, I don't know when this came out, but Hellraiser came out when we were young. And I never saw it as a child. I've seen it now and it's amazing. But I didn't see it as a child. I just saw the cover at the video shop and it scared the life out of me. It was Pinhead, who's like this, white-faced person with like all these nails driven into his skull. Very creepy image. And just seeing that image on the front of a VHS scared the life out of me. So the idea that you might have seen something like Freddy Krueger or another kind of villainous image, maybe even kids' cartoons of a creepy man wearing a hat, that is not surprising at all. That's in our culture.
Yeah, I would lean more to the side of going back further, that it's kind of like archetypal. It's not just in my lifetime. This is in lots of lifetimes.
It certainly goes back a long time. It goes back as far as hats. I think the other creepy thing about it is, so I run in the mornings, and right now it's dark in the mornings when I get up to go for my run. So I wear a high vis, like a yellow vest, in case a car's coming along the road. And the other day I let myself back into the house, and my friend was sitting on the sofa, and he freaked just for a second because he was like, "Who's this strange person wearing workman's clothes coming into the house?" And then he was like, "Oh, it's just Rebecca wearing a stupid vest." Okay, makes perfect sense. But it's something that you don't expect to see inside. A hat is something you wear outside. It's something you'd see in the street. It's not something you see in your bedroom. There's something naturally kind of uncanny and unsettling about someone dressed for the outside in your bedroom.
Yeah, okay, I'm happy with this.
The cool thing about the Freddy Krueger thing, though, is that Freddy Krueger was actually inspired by a news story he read about a Cambodian refugee who was too scared to sleep because of the whole sudden nocturnal death syndrome.
No way, that's where that came from.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So Freddy, I mean, you don't know because you haven't seen the movies, but Freddy Krueger attacks you in your dreams.
Yeah.
And a big part of the movie is the characters try and stay awake to evade him.
Oh, I've seen the Simpsons parody, so I understand the...
Well, then you're familiar, yes.
Okay.
So that thing, and he saw, apparently, I read this great interview with him. I'll put it in the show notes, a link to it in the show notes. But he also saw this creepy homeless man. I mean, that's how he describes him. Who knows? This poor man was probably just minding his own business. But from Wes Craven's perspective, when he was a kid, he saw a creepy homeless man wearing the hat that Freddy wears, which is like a battered fedora. Just like, he saw that. And it stuck with him. And then he read the story about the Hmong refugees and sudden nocturnal death syndrome. And he put those together to make the movie.
Wow.
So this is 1984, the first Freddy Krueger movie comes out. And then in 1985, the first that I know of actual Hat Man in media occurs.
Right.
And it's a Twilight Zone episode called The Shadow Man. And I'll put this in show notes as well, because it really stands the test of time. I didn't watch The Twilight Zone when I was a kid. I think it's a bit before my time. But it's a really, really good episode. And what you described, the fuzzy black figure wearing the hat, it took my breath away when I saw this episode of The Twilight Zone, because I was like, that is exactly the Hat Man. Exactly.
Yeah.
And there it is in an episode of The Twilight Zone in 1985.
Yeah. You wonder...
So the story of this episode is this little boy is lying in bed, and it's not really clear if he's paralyzed or not, but I assumed he was because I was researching sleep paralysis. And then out from under his bed comes the shape of the figure of the man, the blurry black shadow is actually a fedora more than a top hat, so not exactly like your man. And he says, "I am the Shadow Man, and I will never harm the person under whose bed I live." And then he goes out through the window to do his deeds, and he starts killing like local kids. And the kid is like, "Whoa, this is crazy. What's going on?" And then the kid cocks up some scheme because he's like a bullied kid. He's having a hard time of it. So he cooks up a scheme to go to the local park where he knows that the Shadow Man has been. And he challenges this bully to meet him there, like as a test of to see who's the braver. And they both come along, and he knows he's safe because the Shadow Man lives under his bed. And then they're in the park standing there, and the Shadow Man comes up, and the other kid, the bully, just runs away completely freaked out. He's like, "Ha ha ha, this is brilliant." And then the Shadow Man like looms down on the little kid and like starts picking him up, and he's like, why you said you never hurt me, and you never hurt someone whose bed you live under. And the Shadow Man says, "But I am a Shadow Man from under someone else's bed." Ha ha ha. And that's how it ends.
Nice. So I was going to say, up until that ending point, it's like a nice story that you would tell to your kid who's being bullied, stressed out, can't sleep, sees the Shadow Man. Yeah. You would basically tell them that story up until that end. Yeah.
But it's like a good little morality play, because it's like, don't be scared of the thing that comes to you in your bedroom, but also don't tempt fate.
Yeah.
And start trying to like sick him on your bullies, because that's not on.
Yeah, I like that.
But it wasn't. So I can't find an instance of seeing the Hat Man in media before that, and I also can't find an instance of someone reporting having an experience with the Hat Man. The report has been made before that date. Lots of people have said, it happened to me when I was a child, but they said that post 1985.
Yeah, exactly. And they could have been a kid around that time. So you're saying it probably is that film, even though I haven't technically seen it. Like I said, I know the story.
I'm not saying it's the film. I'm just saying there are these cultural like memes that come up.
Yeah.
And they're expressed in different ways.
Yeah.
But it's definitely the big question is, right? You saw the Hat Man. Other people might have seen the Hat Man. Why are we seeing the same thing? And the explanation a lot of people reach for is because he's real. But a more likely explanation is because it's a cultural meme and you're surrounded by your culture. Like all these things play into what you believe and what you see and what you expect to see. So, and
we do still carry. I mean, the guy, what's his name? I want to say Rupert Sheldrake talks a lot about this, but we kind of have these biological fears that are passed on from our ancestors. That's why certain things like tallness is more threatening. Yeah.
So there's going to be certain sort of like you say, archetypes that freak us out more than others.
It's very, it would be ridiculous if we all started seeing Jigglypuff from Pokemon, like that would not be the scary thing. A pink balloon shaped thing is not going to scare anyone because that's not in our biology and it's not in our cultural, the meme thing. Yeah.
Yeah. What I'm really interested in is, like we said at the beginning, how different our responses to and interpretations of these things were. And I think the fact that I'm a horror fan and you're not, I think is actually really interesting. I had a long conversation with someone the other day who was trying to understand what could possibly be wrong with me that I would like horror movies. And she was like, well, why do you like being scared? And I was like, no, what's curious is why you don't like being scared.
I've had this exact conversation with a friend and we couldn't get to the bottom of it. So what is it?
Well, we don't really know, basically. I mean,
it's
the theory,
weird, isn't it?
The reason why people like horror is the theory that goes around among the people who research this stuff is it's really useful to be able to rehearse scary situations in a safe environment.
Okay.
So it's like threat simulation. So if you can watch the scary thing about Freddy Krueger, then maybe you'll know how to deal better with the real Freddy Krueger in real life, I guess.
Right.
There's
crap.
There's some personality stuff around this. So people who are high in sensation seeking, openness, intellect, imagination are more likely to enjoy horror. There's like a personality profile of people who enjoy it.
Yeah.
And you're right, obviously, like if Freddy Krueger came at me in real life, I wouldn't be able to deal with it. But you could see how it would be an evolutionary advantage to be able to think through scary situations and what you do rather than not even be able to think about them.
So what's funny...
If you were so scared, you couldn't even imagine what would happen or something. Do you see what I mean?
Yes. As a kid, I really did like horror. It wasn't until my sort of mid-20s that I stopped liking it. And I wonder if
that's
I
weird.
became... Yeah, and I was really into horror. It was like my favourite genre for my teens and early 20s. But then something changed and I wonder if I just got more sensitive. I stopped wanting to feel fear. Like if I have enough fear in a day-to-day life, why would I add to that?
When I was reading around the research around this, I did find the typical profile, as well as the other personality stuff I just mentioned, is a young man, like early 20s man. That's the person most likely to like horror movies.
And maybe it just goes down over time. In the same way, like our music taste might change a bit over time. Like there are lots of tolerances.
Also, if we think of it as an evolutionary adaptation, then you can see how like young men are the ones who are going to have to defend the cave, I don't know, like in our history. So it does make sense that they'd be better able to deal with and have to deal with thinking about really scary things. So the other thing that I thought was interesting is I thought maybe I'm less scared because I'm a skeptic and I don't think these things are real.
That's the other thing. And if I go to bed, there is a chance I'm thinking, but that thing might be in my bed. Somewhere in my brain, I won't lie. Like there is definitely... If I've watched, like I said, I didn't watch that documentary, not because I knew I'd be scared watching it at the time, even though I knew I would. It was how my life would be affected afterwards. Would I go to bed that night having bad dreams, seeing the Hat Man?
So that's another thing that people have studied. Are people who believe in the paranormal more frightened of paranormal horror movies? And the answer is yes, but also they're more likely to seek them out.
Oh, funny. Yeah.
So it's that thing. If you're really scared of something, either you want to avoid it completely or you want to master it by watching it and understanding it. So those are like the two responses. And people who are more skeptical are more likely to enjoy natural horror. So like serial killers or something non-paranormal. So I don't know why I like the paranormal stuff. Because I much prefer that to serial killers.
But maybe that is to do with personality and like you're obviously not interested in talking about paranormal things. And maybe that's...
Yeah, obviously.
You've been there and there is part of your personality that is inclined to have liked it,
Yeah. The other thing I found was studies on disgust. And it's generally found that people are more repulsed by footage of surgeries and factory farms more than gory horror movies.
Yeah.
Because they see the latter is fictional, so they have like psychological distance from them. Yes. They're like, oh, that's that's ghosts and even like serial killers and stuff. That's never going to happen to me. But if you look at footage of factory farms or if you look at footage of surgeries, I mean, most people don't even think those are bad things. Almost everyone doesn't think a necessary surgery is a bad thing, but people are much more disgusted by that because it seems more real.
Yes, yeah. I still could never watch those ER programs.
Yeah, they really bother me. I don't like them either. But I will happily watch someone be chopped to pieces by a paranormal ghost or something.
I loved
Or Freddy Krueger.
the Saw films as a kid. And they are ridiculously violent.
It's very strange how fear works and what exactly it's for. There's so much literature on it, and I only just skimmed the surface. But it's fascinating how different people experience it differently, and how, yeah. It's also interesting how it all ties into, I mean, a lot of the stuff, if you start reading about shadow people and the Hat Man, you can't help but find Christian stuff.
Interesting.
So lots of people think that the Hat Man is the devil.
Oh, yeah. There's always devil speak.
Which is unsurprising, I suppose. But it always surprises me because for example, I was just looking the other day at stuff to do with the Loch Ness Monster, as you do. And it had never occurred to me that the Loch Ness Monster, people think that he's an extinct dinosaur, she's an extinct dinosaur, which links to creationism and Christianity again. So like people are using these things to prop up their belief systems in ways that I couldn't, as an atheist living in the UK, I wouldn't even understand or predict that.
No.
But yeah, apparently the Hat Man has straight out introduced himself as Scratch.
Who's Scratch?
Which is another word for the devil.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Scratch or Mr. Scratch. Yeah, it's like an old folklore term for the devil.
I like that name. I'd call a cat that. What a good name.
Yeah, it would be cute. Yeah, Black Cat would be a great name for a black cat. So like there's obviously a fear of hell and of the devil, which is very common in people. And so maybe it's finding expression through things like Hat Man.
How funny. Yeah, it's like we naturally, I mean, all of this sleep paralysis stuff is having this kind of dark, faceless fear naturally inside us because we're programmed to have this thing to keep us safe. And our ability to express that like in the outside world through horror stories, like Dante's vision of hell, which wasn't in the Bible. This was just Dante coming up with it. Like all of this is just our expressing of it. And scaring each other shit.
And it was, but what's really scary about it, and that's where we come to like the harms of this. I mean, obviously we talked about what happened in Zanzibar, which is horrible, but the way that can sort of take on a life of its own.
Yeah.
Like, have you heard of Slender Man?
No.
Oh God, if you think the Hat Man's bad, Slender Man's worse. Slender Man is a tall, dark figure. Surprise, surprise. He's usually bald, wears a trench coat, has tentacles, and we actually know exactly where he came from because he was part of a horror fiction thing. Like there's some forum called Something Awful, and someone wrote a short story about, or I don't know exactly how it started, but someone wrote some fiction about the Slender Man, and the Slender Man comes for you, and the Slender Man has to be like, you have to make sacrifices to him and stuff. He's just this creepy dude who lives in the wood. He's tall, shadowy, has tentacles. Not good news, basically. And that just spread like crazy all throughout like 2009, 2010. People on all the subreddits for horror fiction were talking about Slender Man. And I don't remember exactly what year this happened, but a couple of years later, and there were two schoolgirls who ended up stabbing a friend of theirs or another schoolgirl 19 times because they wanted to sacrifice her to Slender Man. And the girl didn't die. And obviously those girls probably had other psychological difficulties. But something that just comes out, we have, like you say, we have this fear. It has no face. We give it a face and then we start feeding it.
Yeah. Oh my God. Brilliant. Yeah, that'll be the quote.
And it becomes something really, really dangerous that can actually hurt people in real life. Like those people who were killed for being witches in Zanzibar, like this girl who was stabbed by her friends because they believed in Slender Man.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, like, on a very basic thing, it's kind of like, you'll scare yourself and have bad dreams. But at that end of the spectrum, terrifying. So
I found, on my researching, I found a podcast. I can't remember what it's called, and I wouldn't recommend it anyway. But it was a couple of women doing a podcast about paranormal topics, and they were doing an episode on, I don't know whether it was specific. I don't think it was specifically on Hat Man. It could have just been shadow people generally. And they are both intuitives, which I take to mean interested in woo. I don't know.
We will. We'll do a podcast on that.
Great. Well, they were intuitives, whatever that means. And one of them has a psychic child, as you would expect. And the psychic child saw a shadow person, or it might have been Hat Man, but anyway, some shadow person. And instead of saying to the kid, "Don't worry, this is what sleep paralysis is, you're perfectly safe," she got down on her knees and said, "Let's pray and throw light at him."
Wow. Okay.
And I think it's kind of like what your dad did, right? When you came downstairs and said, I've had this terrifying experience, he said, yeah, that's for real. And here's some other ghost stories. I mean, your dad wasn't quite as bad as this woman, in my opinion.
But it was still feeding it. It wasn't like my sister.
It was feeding it, yeah.
Who gave me the Wikipedia article, you know.
And that's what I experienced as a child as well. I had a stepmother who believed in a lot of just really strange, you know, esoteric nonsense. And I was a scared kid and an anxious kid, and I had all sorts of strange experiences, and I tell her about them, and she'd do little rituals with sage and stuff to get rid of them, which is nice in a way, because it's like, don't worry, I'll protect you. But in another way, it's affirming that the thing is real. She's like, you're right to be scared, but don't worry, I have the solution. Whereas maybe it'd be more helpful to say, you're wrong to be scared, there's nothing to be scared of.
Yeah. So, I mean, what would you say about, you know, this whole thing? Like, what would you like to happen in the story of sleep paralysis in the world?
I would like more people to know about it and about how it works and how, you know, like what it is. Because another anecdote, see, this is the thing, this is why I think it must be more common than the Brian Sharpless's study suggests. I met a guy, it might just be the sort of people I meet though. So I met a guy who was from Brazil, I think, somewhere in South America. And he was talking about this experience he had. He described a classic case of sleep paralysis. And he says, I never talked to anyone about it because I know that if I talked about it back home, they would do an exorcism on me, and I don't want that to happen. I don't think it's demons, but I don't know what it is. I'm pretty sure it's not demons, but I don't want to, you know, get them all doing that nonsense. So he was in this difficult position. And I said, well, I have the answer for you. It's sleep paralysis. Just give that a Google. Because I'd heard of it by then, which... like, I don't know what he did with that information, but having the actual scientific explanation at your fingertips is really useful. And that's part of the reason why I think it's really important when anyone says like old hag or any of these things, just say the word sleep paralysis, because everyone has access to Google. Everyone can look at Wikipedia and find out what it is.
And it also makes sense. Like, this is one of the ones where I'm like, okay, I'm on your side here, because it makes sense that we know that we're paralyzed when we're asleep. We know how powerful our basically imagination can be and our storytelling abilities to make sense of the world around us. And the big takeaway for me is, if I get sleep paralysis, I know I have to look at my actual life. How am I dealing with stress? Am I sleeping properly? I'm obviously not, because I've just had this experience, but like, how can I adjust things in the real world and not just think that I'm being haunted or something?
Yeah. So if you're out there and you're like, oh my God, what are they talking about? I'd love to have this experience. It sounds thrilling, which is unlikely, but possible. I have something to leave you with, a little recipe for how to experience sleep paralysis or how to up your chances of experiencing sleep paralysis. It's just a few simple steps. 1, you need to get yourself good and exhausted. Jet lag is perfect. It's really, really tired. Maybe don't sleep for a couple of nights. Then when you do sleep, have some alcohol before bed. Just a couple of glasses of wine, because alcohol suppresses REM sleep, which disrupts your circadian rhythms. So that's what you need to do. Then once you lie down to bed, a little bit drunk, sleep on your back, because most people experience it whilst on their back. Not all, but most people do. Make sure you're disturbed frequently throughout your sleep. So like I said before, in the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, they set alarms to go off at intervals to make sure they stay awake. That's a great way to guarantee sleep paralysis. If none of that works, you can increase your BMI, because people with a higher body mass index are more likely to get sleep paralysis. I know it sounds like going a little bit far just to have this experience, but you know, or get pregnant. Pregnancy, pregnant women often get sleep paralysis. And also, it's much more common.
Also, stress yourself out with work and any other kind of stresses that you want to put on your life.
Oh yeah, I didn't even put into account all the stress stuff. Yeah, when you're lying there a little bit drunk, trying to get to sleep on your back, start thinking about everything that stresses you out and worries you. Think about that as hard as you can.
So would we recommend this experience?
I would not recommend it. I've just told you how to do it, but don't do it.
Don't do it.
Now you know how. Don't do it.
I would not recommend this either. It's not fun. But know that you're not alone if you do experience it.
Yeah, it's we don't know exactly how common, but it is common. And there's a much more rational explanation for it than ghosts are real. So, sleep tight, listeners.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode. let us know with a tweet or an email. We'd really love to hear about your experiences.
Yes, please tell us what we got wrong. You can email us at hello@seekerandskeptic.com and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @seekerskeptic.
You'll find the show notes for this and every episode at seekerandskeptic.com.
And if you're interested, you can find my skeptically themed comics at rebeccaonpaper.com or follow me on Twitter @RebeccaOnPaper.
And I'm at yoga_astrology on Twitter. And you can find me exploring the intersection of yoga and astrology at yogaandastrology.com.
If you liked what you heard and fancy supporting the show and spreading the word, we'd really appreciate a rating and review in the Apple Podcast Store or wherever you're listening.
Or just tell somebody you know about the show. Thanks for listening.